Thank you so much to organizers for putting this together under untypical circumstances. The paper, Feliks Tuszko is obviously not here, and he cannot join us online, but this is very much a co-authored project. Where this project fits, I think, in the narrative of this very interesting workshop is it takes up some issues of inequality and stratification, and the degree to which within the social stratification there are transformations that perhaps increase this inequality, as we heard earlier in the day. Also ideas of perception of inequality and how people imagine the social life, and most specifically to Justina and others' presentation, focusing on generations and intergenerational relations. The research that I will be talking about is done under the larger framework of a project led by Magda Olson-Kubicka at the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology that focuses on relational work around money, finance, and wealth between generations of those starting life. Although this project that I'm going to be talking about, I have shared our very preliminary paper on the project's website. So this is from this paper, and any comments and questions will help us finalize. This project shifts from our usual concern with processes of middle classing or the middle class as a category that's both in a contested way objectively existing, but also imagined, and turning attention to something that I feel has not been researched extensively, at least in the qualitative ethnographic approach that I'm using, which is what we might call the Polish 1%, right? So the Polish ultra wealthy, the Polish generation of the Polish money elite, right? Of course, overlapping with the elite. And so this work, I'll try to speak for about 20 minutes and then leave sometimes for question. The first thing to say about this work is that it's trying to complement the current post-Piketty and many others' interest in large-scale comparative quantitative analyses of equality by enhancing it by ethnographic, fine-grained, culturally oriented analyses that essentially ask, okay, what if there is inequality and there's rising inequality? Of course, one answer for understanding this process could be studying economic and political processes, institution building, taxation, and what have you. But if we really think that inequalities are not found somewhere, but actually actively made in social practice, that they emerge out of specific constellations of social relationships and institutions, how does that happen, right? How are inequalities created? And one way of thinking about this is to look at the intermediaries that help create these inequalities, right? So this is positioning the work in an emerging stream of research that's looking at lawyers, financial engineers, policymakers, lobbies, and so on and so forth, that participate actively in the creation of inequalities, right? So when I'm talking about succession, I won't be talking about neither the nesters or those who will pass on the wealth and power, or the successors, so those who will inherit or receive the wealth and power, but I will be talking about a very particular kind of actors that live in between, right? Our approach is temporal, so Feliks and I have decided to frame the production, reproduction of inequality through the lens of temporal expectations, right? And so we look at management consultants, tax, business, family attorneys, wealth managers, psychotherapists, coaches, and other external experts who organize and manage succession processes in wealthy entrepreneurial families in Poland, right? Hence we call them engineers of succession. And to just give you a sense of what this is, why are we talking about this now? Some tabloid covers from from way before COVID 1 year ago. Increasingly more and more coverage of scandals like these, right? So this happens in a company called Drutex, which is an, as the name does not suggest, actually a mogul on a European, if not pan-national scale in the production of windows. In a nutshell, the conflict is that the founder of Drutex has been separated, although informally, with his first wife, started a new family with actually one of the managers of at Drutex, never formally divorced, and the struggle that ensued, the family struggle around betrayal, possibly divorce, future inheritance, 2 sets of children, one from first marriage who are already adult and working at Drutex, other children from the new relationship that are 3 and 4. All of this culminated in this giant crisis that had repercussions way beyond sort of tabloid gossip, right? What's interesting to us in this research is looking at how the intimate relations, when observed and when analyzed in among those who are the ultra wealthy, those who create the 1% of a population, how these cannot be really disentangled from the operations of capitalism. Of course, to any of you who binge watch or not binge watch HBO, you'll find that this resonates, of course, with a theme of a recent hit show called Succession, which is this sort of Shakespearean, although very well researched, look at the both economic and financial and legal and intimate dynamics that govern the passing of wealth. But what does it mean to study it in Poland? And so I wanted to show you these images. We're still with Drutex, I think, also because of the name. Drutex can be used as a sort of type ideal of a Polish post-socialist transformation enterprise that starts from a very small, quite informal, quite shabby situation in the sort of bottom left, right? Somebody starts a firm. It just so happens it's 1987. The market is opening up. There's marketization, commercialization, and so on and so forth. It's a small family. Then move forward 30 years later, on the right, you see the same company having this extensive property, having operations that are on national scale, and the number of people, although still very often connected by family ties, is of course expanding. Obviously, what you see on the picture on the top right is only the management, right? The picture does not include hundreds and hundreds of laborers who work in the Drutex factories. Suffice to say, the firm is one of the biggest employers in Zachodniopomorskie. The owning family has been consistently on Forbes 100 list, right? And so what does this bring to the analysis of the unintended and expecting inequalities and actually managing these expectations, right? 20 years ago, Jill Eyal, Ivan Sheleny, and Eleanor Townsley, and I owe this observation to Magdalena Serafin, have asked and answered a theoretical puzzle. Theirs was, how was it possible to create capitalism in post-communist societies without any capitalists, right? So in terms of thinking about social structures, how do you create capitalism when there's no bourgeoisie, essentially, right? Many of you might know the answer. We might not be getting into this, but if this question of how capitalism is created in a post-socialist space was a question that was typical to the 90s, it seems we would argue that we're right now getting to a point where the question is different, right? There is something like bourgeoisie. There is a number of extremely wealthy entrepreneurs. what's happening generationally, right? So if you think back to Drutex and, you know, a 40-year-old man starting a company with his family in 1987, there's a cohort effect in which all of these entrepreneurs are increasingly getting older, considering retirement, perhaps passing away in a timely or untimely manner. The concern is new. The concern is not how to make capitalism without capitalists, but how to make capitalists patrimonial wealth, or how to make the ways in which this patrimonial wealth is also capital survive or endure across generations, right? So the question is, how do we make financial but also familial capitalism endure across generations, and how do we being the Forbes 100, obviously, asking this question, how do we make the thing endure, right? And here a very brief comment on how we imagine capitalism, especially in the post-socialist reality. Very often, if you look at you know, your basic handbook of sociology, or your, you know, introductory lecture in economics or management, very often the family firm is sort of sidelined somehow, right? The story we are told is a story that in the modernization, capitalism will become more and more managerial, right? And sure, there's going to be anachronistic capitalist forms that were framed as rooted in the family, but increasingly we will going to be moving to the model of the stock market, institutional shareholders who are anonymous, hire external managers, have all these rules that say that nepotism is wrong, that you shouldn't mix the familial and the business, and so on and so forth, right? Of course, in contrast, if you start doing this, and the work of economic anthropologists like Sylwia Yanagisako is a very good example of that. There is actually ample evidence from around the globe that shows that family firms are an enduring, resilient forms of profit seeking, and are not at all an archaic, transient form of capitalism that will disappear, right? And you can do this exercise from country to country. It's a little bit problematic to their competing definition of what a family firm is, but suffice to say, significant chunks of capital is held not by anonymous shareholder, but by dynastic families. And if Piketty and his team and other who are studying inequalities are correct, this dynamic is actually on the increase, right? So we're actually observing something like the restoration of family dynastic or patrimonial capitalism, right? So we can do a short experiment that Feliks and I did. We looked at Forbes 100 first, and then we've noticed something weird. It would seem, just from the title, for those who are not Polish speaking, it literally says 100 most wealthy Poles, so individuals also coded as male linguistically. Whereas if you start exploring this, actually the unit of analysis, even for Forbes, is very different, right? And I don't have this done for Forbes on me right now because COVID. So let's shift to the other magazine that's been doing this, which is the Frost 100 Wealthiest People. And in green, we have highlighted all the instances in which on the 100 richest Poles list, the unit, the richer Pole, is actually not an individual, right? So what it looks like is this, right? You have an individual, number 57, Edgar Łukasiewicz, but that's a 13-year-old at the moment of inheriting his father's wealth. We have Irena Eris I Henryk Orfinger, right? So we have married couples, and we have this mysterious and very unclear phrasing in which we say this person with family, or we don't even say an individual, we'll say just the Weichert family is among the 100 rich, right? So this is the crux of the research, right? The way we're doing this research and how we're trying to study, we're using ethnography to observe the rise of events, closed coaching programs, workshops, and legal processes run by whom we call engineers of succession, that are essentially trying to work with these families, concerned with their future and expecting that their wealth might be dissipated or are taken over by wrong people in their sense. And we're observing and trying to observe and understand through interviews their practice. It also involves going to golf fields, because such is the ethnographic of the elite. And of course, conceptually, what the engineers of succession are trying to do. So imagine a psychotherapist that's been brought on board to settle a family struggle, or imagine a lawyer that's brought on board to change the structure of the firm from a single owner company into a holding company, or is trying to build a foundation in Luxembourg. Is they're trying to disentangle and reentangle, and all these images that you're seeing right now are images from the field. So, you know, there's a lot of compulsive drawing of Venn diagrams. What is family wealth? What is company's capital? How does ownership, management, and family interact in a generative or positive way, or in a complex way, right? So all these ways in which whom we call engineers of succession work. For lack of time, I will just show you some or two examples of engineers, or modes of engineering. One is the legal mode of engineering, in which we are actually trying to use formal institutions of the law in order to produce the durability. Katharina Pister has a brilliant book called The Codes of Capital, and one of the things she argues is that if you think about capital in the contemporary world, the law is actually one of the key things, or one of the key operations, or one of the key institutions that transforms stuff, money, into capital, because the law is able to protect and make durable wealth, right? So you have a whole new subset of lawyers and legal firms that have specified their work as catering to wealth understood not as held by a single mortal individual, but who are trying to establish something that in the Anglo-Saxon word we would know as trusts. In the civil law sphere of Europe would be, for example, family foundations, right? Another crop of these experts have nothing to do with law. They are very often trained in management, but deeply, deeply rooted in the sort of psychologized coaching and therapy and workshop and training culture. And they're essentially saying, well, it starts with a head, right? You shouldn't start with say redrawing your will. If there's a conflict in the family, first the family needs to go through either family therapy or workshops in which different goals are negotiated. Mediators are part of this world, and so on and so forth. And if you go to the paper, what we're trying to do is to reconstruct the practice of these engineers of succession, doing four things. First, looking at how succession is, in Poland specifically, but also more generally throughout the region, how succession is framed as a problem, right? Obviously, for reasons of their own commerce and for reasons of their own benefit, the engineers of succession are really promoting this problem of succession, right? And according to their calculations, quite well known number is the year 2028, when and many succession engineers will show you a graph. That's the year that there's expected to be peak successions, meaning that the first generation of Polish bourgeoisie will be dying out in the largest extent, right? But this making of the problem is also the work, and that's the interesting part for me, is also the work of the government, right? So enough Polish GDP is bound up in family firms, right? Enough of what under the logics of creating national capital, of creating Polish capital, of building up the Polish economy, is bound up in family firms, is that actually the government, usually in the form of PARP, so Polska Agencja Rozwoju Przedsiębiorczości, the entrepreneurship promotion arm of the Polish government, is recognizing that in order to, on a macro scale, preserve and grow Polish capital, they need to, on the micro scale, intervene in family dynamics, right? And so the succession process is an interesting combination of these, right? And then the paper, which you can download from the website, is trying to disentangle the psychological, right, in which different experts, I'm happy to talk about more in the question answer section, are trying to shift the attitude of the young people and trying to make the family work in a way that the passing of money and wealth is at all possible. In the third section, we're looking at those who say that if a successor is 30 years old or 35 years old, as it's often the case, it's already too late. And these are people who are trying to build up a very closely knit network of Polish bourgeoisie by means of cultivating heirs and heiresses in a much earlier stage, right? So we're talking about expensive private schools that are specifically aimed at making young people understand what it's like to manage a family company and so on and so forth. And the fourth section of the paper, which we called cleaning up or making architecture, or how lawyers called capital, is forked into two problems. One problem is is a problem of how increasingly the wealthy families in Poland run up against the family law, right? So very often what even very wealthy people in Poland imagine the relationship between their will regarding their wealth in the future runs up against what the Polish family law, that's based on largely on the sort of Napoleonic civil code, says, right? And so very often along the lines of, you know, an American movie, a father wants to, it's also a very gendered world. So if a wealthy father wants to give everything to his oldest son, thereby excluding two other siblings. But of course, the institution of legitim or zachowek is preventing him from doing this, right? So this might create a strife that's not only significant to the family, because if you imagine that at stake is, say, one of the 3 or one of the 7 biggest Polish companies, is if it's the case of Dutex, this kind of strife that otherwise we would sort of psychologize and say this is a private affair of some family, it has nothing to do with the large picture of how the economy works. It actually may result in, you know, large-scale unemployment in the region, or the halting of production, and so on and so forth. And the second fork,
running out of time.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, so please jump to the conclusion,
good.
okay?
I'll jump. That is the conclusion, in fact.
Okay.
And the second fork in which the lawyers are trying to go is to write new laws, right? And so we are. This is somebody calling on my door. Welcome to working from home. It is about. Sorry, got distracted there. It is about writing new laws. So it's about trying to figure out whether the Polish system can accommodate something like I'm sorry, somebody's calling at my door and wouldn't stop. So I am assuming now it has to be an emergency on part of my neighbors. So let me stop here. And on the fact that we're looking at succession, and I will be back with you in a minute.
Okay. Okay. So please think about questions, quick questions to Mateusz when he'll be back.
unexpected consequences of running an online conference and staying at home.
Okay. Yeah, that's maybe some short questions.
Okay, and I'm
okay,
back.
you're back.
I have
Great.
survived. Good.
Okay. So yeah.
Yep.
Thank you very
Questions
much.
and comments, please. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you
and
very
sorry
much.
for running
Now
over.
it's time for comments and questions, please. Anybody?
Okay, I have a question. I don't know too much about succession, but so for me the way I looked at your paper and the presentation is that it's about preparation.
Mm-hmm.
They are preparing, and now as I said at the beginning of the conference, this is also a topic I'm engaged in the sense that how we are preparing from 2 months now for the consequences of COVID. Yeah, so this preparation I think in economic sociology you can relate it to, it's like an intersection of like analytical frameworks that are developing. It's about uncertainty, it's about expectations, it's about the future. But can you maybe if you would be required to present this succession as a preparation, what interesting Polish elements would you find here? So what is Polish about the preparation for the succession, which you don't find in the Succession movie? So how are Poles preparing? Because they are preparing for COVID. I think they are preparing if they have to. So this is what my there has to be a pressure to prepare, and then you prepare. And once there is no pressure or there is no internal engine, then you don't prepare anymore. So how would you, if you were to switch the angle?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. That's a great question. Thank you. Yes, succession is very much about preparation. What the ways in which the people we observe are actually legitimizing the work and what they're selling is that they're saying that everybody is unprepared, right? And so it's not an accident that one of the lawyers I'm working with has earlier worked in insurance, right? So what they're saying is, and they very often use public events like the death of Piotr Woźniak-Starak, for example, right? A young man who dies suddenly. And that's been on everybody's mind in these events, or events when somebody dies without a will. So preparedness in that sense is about extension of temporal horizon, right? So these are what's specific to the region. I wouldn't say just Poland, I would say to the region, is that these companies were started in 1987 from a garage, and then both the pace of work within the families, but also the pace of growth of the Polish economy was such that there was no space to sort of stand back and say, okay, what are we, right? And so a lot of the structures, for example, economic structures of these firms actually remember 1987 because they're based, on a single owner of a single company, right? And their scale is actually not matched at all by the modern sort of advanced corporate structures that you have to preserve the wealth, right? And so the preparation becomes about stepping back from the day-to-day and extending the temporal horizon. That's the first thing, right? So it's thinking about, if you're thinking about your children, it's already too late. You need to be thinking about your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren, right? And the question is, how do you extend your control beyond your life into this future? And it also implies working with scenarios, right? So what the touchy subject is that there's a point at which these lawyers, therapists, and so on and so forth need to sit down with a family, draw out the genealogical tree, or what they call a genogram, that has both factographic information but also psychological information, right? They have to understand where there might be strife. They have to understand where there's conflict between siblings. They have to convince someone to come clean about an illegitimate child that they have from another relationship that might be a secret, but the secret needs to be built in, and so on and so forth. And then these scenarios are run in permutations that are unimaginable to people, right? So questions appear like, if if a couple has a car crash and one person dies on the scene and another dies in the hospital, in this scenarios, there's actually two legal procedures for inheritance, right? Because there's a literal temporal succession of deaths, and even if they're separated by 7 hours, the Polish law needs to separate it out, right? So it's essentially about preparations, and I'll end on this. The practitioners from the legal side of this, essentially what their motto is that we need to prepare such that nothing goes to court, right? So it's very often a practice of trying to avoid litigating post hoc, avoid litigating after death, and actually using notaries, using economic structure, using psychological tools of mediation, and using, you know, sort of foreign modes of offshore wealth, like foundations in Luxembourg, is to arrange everything such that it becomes sort of foolproof system and foolproof structure that extends into the future.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Hi, hi everyone. This is Sam calling from the UK. Mateusz, thank you. That was fascinating. I just to say one thing, one sort of quick question, and then maybe a slightly more developed one. The first was I have a colleague at the LSE here in London who's called Luna Glucksberg, who's kind of looking at some similar issues, and through the lens of a particular formation, of the idea of a family office. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered if that that kind of entity operates in the same way in the context that you're studying, and then I suppose the second question is kind of how these sort of issues interact with a kind of discourse of meritocracy, and whether there is any ways in which that frames some of the ways in which these kind of issues of succession are talked about, thought about by the practitioners that you're interested in. I mean, you talked about the HBO show Succession, which I love. And I kind of read, you know, the tensions of the inheritors mm-hmm. is very much about them sort of needing to prove themselves in this purportedly meritocratic way in various senses. And I just kind of wondered how that played out in a Polish context, and how prominent that discourse was, and how it interacted with these issues. But thank you, it was great.
Thanks so much. Thank you for the reference to somebody working on family offices. I'm gonna hit you up for details later. The institution of family office as such does not yet exist in Poland, to my knowledge. But of course, the practitioners who are, we're talking about a field that's in statu nascendi very much. So the practitioners do draw on the family office tradition, which is much more Anglo-Saxon than sort of continental European. But one of my interlocutors who's developed a quite successful office is actually trained in London, working with I believe Dubai and Doha families, if I'm not wrong, helping run their family offices. To a large extent, the work of family office, so the work of managing sort of family's wealth, is done by private banking in Poland, which is a rising and new sort of chunk of banking that has not existed largely, 20 years back, and attorneys, right? But there is an expressed desire to create something like family office. But I would say that many of the families, even the very wealthy families, are still in the process of, because they're first generation entrepreneurial families, they're first generation bourgeois, they're still in the process of actually figuring out what under this bourgeois logic consists of family and what consists of firm. So they're almost earlier in the process than being ready to start a family office, because very often there's a murky and from a legal perspective risky blurred boundary between you know, the house or the inheritable familial wealth and the company's capital, right? So I would imagine that the creation of the family office largely comes next. To your question about meritocracy, I think it's very interesting. First of all, I think that the public interest, I guess myself included, in this process of embourgeoisement, or this process of creation of dynastic families in Poland, has to do with and here, you know, Mikołaj Cześnik's earlier paper resonates, comes with a sense that there is in Poland a growing sensibility that inheritable wealth is more effectively positioning you in the social space than meritocracy, right? If the language of the 90s, we observed this with Magdalena and Kubicka also with housing, that became an asset to the middle classes that's almost more important than education, right? If in the 90s it was about, let's learn English, give our children a good education, find them a corporate job, right? Now these inequalities are being clear. And meritocracy also in this context, in this space, has to do with ideas of modernization, right? So there's a very interesting effect, a class effect that Bourdieu would call habitus clivé, in which very often the owners of the firms have had basic education, were recruited from popular classes, very low cultural capital, some social capital, but like in a very small sort of local networks of very often rural or small town elites. But they've of course had the means, resources, and aspirations to educate their children extremely well, right? So you have these figures of children who have studied in London, studied in the US, and so on, and they're coming back. And the only problem is that these children are coming back and they're saying, well, this is a sausage factory. We're deeply, after our studies in London, we're deeply uninterested in large-scale production of sausage, right? Like it's not something within our habitus, right? So the meritocracy part becomes partly about this discourse of globalization, right? That these and modernization. So there's a figure of a child who knows software as opposed to the families. There's a figure of a child who speaks English, and so I'm finishing. And so this meritocracy becomes about modernization. Yeah.
And tell us who was at the door.
Oh yes.
Who was at the door? It was a very insistent delivery person who just would not leave the package on the door. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your
all.
presentation.